meeting to order. First of all, this is a public hearing to deal with the rezoning for 3238 Granville and 1402 McRae Avenue. We're going to have a number of speakers. I think we have 42 listed now. We will most likely not get through the public hearing tonight. If that's the case, we will come back on Tuesday, February 19th at 7:30 p.m. in the council chambers. So I'll remind the speakers that there's no time limit for whatever you wish to say to us, but for your first opportunity to speak, you could speak for 5 minutes. If you have more to say, you should let me know at that time, and I will put your name down, and you can come at the end and complete your presentation. That will make sure everybody has the opportunity to speak. I just urge you, though, because there are a lot of speakers, you feel free to make your comments brief and pertinent and to the topic. And if you have heard people saying, a number of speakers saying the same thing, you can say that you agree with the previous speakers. So we will start the meeting. Can I have the roll call, please?
This is a special meeting of council for the purpose of holding a public hearing. Mayor Sullivan in the chair. Mayor Sullivan is present. Councillor Anton. Councillor Ball. Councillor Cadman is on leave of absence this evening. Councillor Capri. Councillor Chow. Councillor Deal is absent at the moment. Councillor Ladner. Councillor Lee. Councillor Louie is on sick leave this evening, as is Councillor Stevenson. You do have a quorum, Mr. Mayor.
And before I go too far, I'd like to wish everyone happy Valentine's Day. And I know all of us have significant others who we invited to the public hearing to share it with us, but I don't think any of them took up the offer. So we will move in to council. We need to go in a committee of the whole. Councillor Ladner moves. Councillor Anton seconds. All in favor, all opposed, passed unanimously. The clerk will now read the application and the summary of correspondence received.
An application by James Boosie Formworks Architectural Inc. to rezone a portion of the property from FSD for Shaughnessy District to CD1 to allow development of 16 townhouse units and to secure through designation and heritage revitalization agreement the retention and rehabilitation of the Heritage A listed house on the balance of the site. The Director of Planning recommends approval subject to conditions as set out in the agenda before Council this evening, and we have received 2 letters in support and 212 letters in opposition.
Okay, now we have some staff present and the owner, with Vicky Potter, rezoning planner. Good evening, and Brian Bell from Bell Holdings, who is the owner. And I think Vicky Potter would explain the application, and then Mr. Bell would make a presentation.
So good evening, Your Worship, members of Council, and the Shaughnessy neighbours who joined us tonight. I'm here to present for Council's consideration a rezoning application, heritage revitalization agreement, and heritage designation for a 3-parcel site at 1402 McRae and 3238 Granville Street. In addition to the staff report dated January 2nd, 2008, staff has provided Council with 3 yellow memos, 2 that were included in your meeting packets, and 1 provided just today. A number of staff are here to respond to questions about the application. We have Brent Todderan, Director of Planning, Rob Jenkins, Assistant Director of Planning, Scott Hine and Shylon Black from the Planning Department, Jerry Evans from our Real Estate Department, Shelley Bruce with our Heritage staff, Scott Barker with Development Services, and Wally Memon with Engineering Services. This application is first and foremost about retaining and restoring a very significant A-listed heritage building and front grounds in First Shaughnessy. Through this application, the building and grounds would be restored and covenants would be placed on title to protect against future demolition. The owner would be obligated to ensure ongoing maintenance and no additional floor area would be allowed on the heritage site beyond what currently exists. In consideration for entering into these agreements, the applicant seeks to rezone the balance of the site to a CD1 to permit a multiple dwelling use, including 16 townhouse units in 2 buildings, referred to as Block A and Block B. Block B sits nearest the heritage house. And if you want to refer to your report, a site plan is found on page 3 of the staff report. You'll probably use that quite a bit tonight. The CD1 proposal has 3 key aspects that vary from existing First Shaughnessy zoning. The CD1 has an FSR of 0.63, representing 10,300 square feet in excess of the 0.45 FSR that is permitted in First Shaughnessy zoning. Through the HRA, the heritage site's allowable density would be decreased by 10,300 square feet. Overall, the density on both sites would not exceed the 0.45 FSR that is currently allowed in the FSD zone. A second variance this application presents is that all of the floor area in the townhouses would be above grade, as is typical with multiple dwellings. In the First Shaughnessy zoning, only about 2/3 of the floor area can be above grade. Finally, this application introduces a new form of housing, multiple dwelling expressed as townhouses, that is not currently permitted in First Shaughnessy zoning. The application has received considerable attention in the Shaughnessy neighborhood. In discussions I've had with many neighbors and with the main neighborhood organization, the Shaughnessy Heights Property Owners Association, or SHPOA, there are several key concerns. Has the compensation package been fairly calculated? Some believe that the developer will receive a windfall profit from this proposal and that he shouldn't need 16 units to be fairly compensated. They're concerned that the city has not shared the applicant's financial pro forma with the public. You'll recall that at the January referral meeting, Council asked that the Real Estate Department provide additional details of the pro forma, including the methodology used and any financial information that is not considered confidential. This was done and reported in the yellow memo dated January 31st. Staff met with neighbors and their financial consultant, as well as the SHPOA board, to review the information in the yellow memo. Subsequently, an independent pro forma assessment was commissioned by one of the neighbors. Staff has provided feedback on the methodology used in that independent assessment in an effort to ensure that we're comparing apples to apples. Staff stands behind its own methodology and conclusions, which were conducted professionally, consistently, and with the public interest foremost in our minds. A second concern I've heard from the neighbors is about the form of development. They're concerned that the amount of density and the multiple dwelling form proposed cannot be achieved on the lower half of the site in a way that promotes good urban design. Folks seem particularly concerned about Block B, closest to the Heritage House. As the staff report indicates, we do believe that the proposal achieves an acceptable urban design, especially considering the range of objectives to be achieved. All 3 advisory panels agreed. As you know, the applicant explored many different schemes for the site on its own, with staff, and with a co-design group. This scheme proved the best way to accomplish and manage the many objectives for the site. It retains half the site with the heritage house and front grounds as an estate fully intact. It fairly compensates the owner. It places density on the lower half of the site in a way that respects privacy and views of immediately adjacent neighbors. It eliminates the need for an internal road network that would be required with a more traditional single-family pattern, and it thus maximizes landscaped open space. It offers housing choices with a range of unit sizes accommodating families or seniors looking to downsize but remain in the neighborhood. And the project fits well with the more dense developments directly to the south. That said, the advisory panels and staff agree with the neighbors that some adjustments are necessary to building block B to maximize privacy between this block and the Heritage House, and to provide better views from the rear of the Heritage House to the west and from the street to the rear of the Heritage House. Recommended conditions in Appendix B to lower Block B's height, to pull it further away from the Heritage House, and to add additional landscape screening address these concerns. We know neighbors are also concerned about the loss of mature trees on the lower half of the site, believing this to be a green belt that serves many functions, promoting wildlife, decreasing air pollution, offering pleasant views from private residences, and providing a Shaughnessy gateway for drivers and pedestrians going to and from the neighborhood. A councillor referral asked for staff to assess the environmental impacts of the tree loss. Staff agrees that this treed area currently serves all of the functions noted by the neighborhood. However, it is a private development site, and any proposal, even under current zoning, would result in a significant change to its appearance. The arborist report, attached to the yellow memo dated February 7th, concludes that the health of the trees is poor to moderate, and that trying to save select trees would create safety hazards. The landscape plan proposed for the new development will increase the number of trees by 44%, so in time, the site will actually have more vegetation and healthier vegetation. Finally, the neighbors are concerned about the precedent this type of development sets for future proposals in First Shaughnessy. A councillor at the referral meeting asked staff to assess this as well. We reported on this in our February 7th yellow memo, concluding that this site has a very unique set of circumstances that makes it the right site for the application at hand. It has an A-listed house and grounds that are not yet protected from demolition. It is on a large, undeveloped lot on the corner of two arterials. It sits at the edge of the First Shaughnessy District, easy walking distance to the South Granville Commercial District, and it faces higher density RM4 apartments. These characteristics simply do not exist elsewhere in First Shaughnessy. While respecting and acknowledging the neighbors' concerns, staff believes the application strongly meets the intent of council policies, including the citywide heritage policies and guidelines, the ARC's community vision, the transfer of density policy, and key aspects of the First Shaughnessy official development plan. These policies all reiterate the common goal of protecting valuable heritage resources, such as the Nickel House and its noteworthy front grounds. The policies support offering incentives to developers willing to restore and legally designate their heritage resources, incentives including relaxation of regulations. The policies describe circumstances under which new housing forms should be considered on large lots, on arterials, near commercial nodes, all characteristics this application meets. In summary, staff feel this application has successfully responded to council policy on a variety of fronts. It results in retention of an important heritage resource by shifting density from one part of the site to another in a way that results in an acceptable urban design. It also establishes a new form of housing in an array of sizes in an appropriate location. For these reasons, staff recommend approval.
Thank you. You have two questions, Councillor Ladner.
Ms. Potter, just two simple questions for you. One is, you talked about the trees. I wasn't aware of the tree planting before, and the 44% more trees. I find it hard to believe that there would be trees planted that would block the views from all these places. Are these trees seriously going to actually be more vegetation, or we're talking about a lot of little trees that will never be allowed to grow up very high?
I would like to maybe defer that question to the landscape architect who's here, and
okay.
He has a tree planting plan. If you look, though, over at the colored elevation over there, you'll get a sense of what is anticipated.
So they will not actually grow up to block the views. if that's the mature view of where it's going. Anyway, maybe they can answer that. The other thing is, just at a very high level, it's puzzling to me that the 3 advisory panels are solidly in support of this project and the neighborhood is solidly against it. How do you explain that discrepancy?
Well, let me tell you who the advisory panels are and a little bit of background, walk you through that. At the 3 panels who saw this application were the first Shaughnessy Advisory Design Panel, who saw it 3 times actually, once at pre-app and then twice when the application had come in, the Vancouver Heritage Commission and the Urban Design Panel. The Vancouver Heritage, and the minutes of those panels are in your packet. Both the Heritage Commission and the Urban Design Panel voted unanimously to support the application. The Urban Design Panel did have some specific recommendations, and it had to do with the interface between Building Block B and the Heritage House, and staff's recommendations have moved in that direction. The first Shaughnessy panel, the first time it saw it, was voted 7-1 to support it moving on to the next stage. When it saw it again later on in the summer, there wasn't a vote taken. They had some issues that they wanted the developer to go back and resolve, the architect, having to do with the use of the rooftops. That was a big item. The relationship between the Building B and the Heritage House, the privacy issues surrounding that. The third time it came back then, just this last fall to that panel, the vote was much narrower. It was 5-4 in support, but again, some of those issues still remained. I don't know how to explain the difference in opinion between the advisory panels and the neighborhood. I think these kind of applications are always fairly have a high level of interest from the members of the community. I mean, we've seen this before. Not to discount any of their concerns whatsoever, but I don't have a good explanation. Many of the same issues that the neighborhood has raised are things that were raised by the panels, and maybe the difference is the panels felt they could be resolved.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Capri?
Two questions. Were we to not go forward with this tonight and say to the developer, away you go, what would be allowable on this site? What would their option be that they could proceed with without permission from the city or needing to get a change of permission from the city?
They'd have to get development permits for whatever they did, but in terms of the 2 main options would be they could demolish the building and build 3 estate-sized mansions, 1 on each lot at 0.45. The other option would be to, utilizing some of the provisions of the ODP, the First Shaughnessy ODP, they could do a multiple conversion dwelling because it's a pre-1940s house, and that would, so they could put 4 units in the old house. They could do 4 infill units, and then they could develop the last lot along Granville, Lot 1, with a single-family residence. Whether that is financially viable, I believe those options have been explored, or that option. Again, that would be the developer's call if you did refuse this application to go and weigh those different options. But I think it would be staff's advice to council that the requirement in the heritage policies that a Heritage A listed house, prior to approving a demolition, they have to do a financial evaluation and look at alternatives to see if there's any option to retain it. Our advice to council would be they've done that. And if you refuse it tonight, we would say they've accomplished that requirement. So the next thing they would do is really up to the developer. That might be a question. But those are the things that could happen under existing zoning.
So they would not have to come back to council again to get permission to demolish the Heritage House?
It would be our advice to you tonight that you would be making that assumption if you refused the application.
Okay. I want to explore a little bit more the unique nature of the site because, I'm looking at the Schedule A map or just the whole overall map that shows the area.
Yep.
And I understand that one of the unique aspects is the fact that there's this heritage house on there. But at the same time, is there anything else that you can add that would give the neighborhood comfort around the question of creep? Because some would argue that there already was a conversion of a building within the captured area, and I think it's called Greencroft. Right.
Yeah.
And so, there could be an argument that this is the next ripple, and then there's a couple of other sites on Granville Street that could be argued might be appropriate for more density, and the floodgates open. So
what I would say is, and if you look at the February 7th yellow memo, and there's a map attached to the back, so that responds to one of the earlier questions. And that map gives you an indication, so it's Appendix 1 of the February 7th yellow memo. And it gives you an indication, all of the sites that are in a light colored circle, where the dots are, those are Heritage A listed buildings that have not yet been designated. So is this a slippery slope? I would say no to this kind of development because it would take a site with these collection of characteristics under existing policy for staff to say this seems to meet all of the various qualifications. If you look at some of these other sites, though, I think we have to be honest that council policy does direct us, if a Heritage A building anywhere in the city is under threat, to enter into the discussion. In fact, it requires us to do that, and it requires the developer to find an alternative to demolition. And it asks us, staff, and the Director of Planning in his jurisdiction, to find ways to relax the regulations, to offer incentives. So that's the way the policy is structured. Would we see another application like this with this, again, combination of characteristics? I don't think so. I think if you look at the map, it's pretty clear that, let me just find the map, that the three dark circles there along Granville Street, the lots are quite a bit smaller than this. Now the question has come up, could they consolidate with other parcels? If you look at where those parcels would be, none of them would be able to consolidate with another parcel along Granville Street, with the exception possibly of the site to the west of Granville. And again, you'd have to look at the economics of doing that. Would it have to buy up a parcel that has a perfectly good house on it and pay the market price for that house only to tear it all down? And, so what's different about this site is it doesn't have anything else on it. So, and the developable piece is right on the corner of the arterials and right next to the shopping district. So at this time, under these policies, I don't think you're going to find another site in Shaughnessy that has these characteristics. I don't know what future policies might hold, and I do think that you very well will have to deal with all of those Heritage A buildings at some point, and determine what have proposals perhaps come forward to you.
Thank you, Your Worship.
Councillor Lee.
Thank you, Your Worship. Councillor, to ask half of my question now, I'm going to ask from another direction. If this is approved today, if this is that this on page 2 on the item 3, you have listed the characteristics. So it happens that they have this kind of characteristics which helps you to present your case. But should we approve this, will these characteristics set a precedence as a preconditions for similar development? Is that you have to have not only an A-list, it has the situation on an arterials, the situation near a shopping area on a large site. It becomes a specific precondition.
I don't think I'd go so far as to say that. When an application comes before us, we look at all the policies that are there at the time. And if you are able to respond to one policy but not 10 others, your application would be considered perhaps weak. This application responded to so many of the different policies that Council has given staff to assess applications under, that the support mounted around looking at those policies and also looking at our own, using the advice from the panels and our own urban design expertise to say, on balance, does all of this work?
So,
your choice of word, Councillor, but just remind Council, as I've done a few other times, that neither you nor I, as the Director of Planning, are bound by precedent in any land use considerations. I like to say there's no such thing as precedent, because in my career I've never seen two exactly the same applications, ever. And I don't think I ever will. So I think it's a matter of whether or not, as Ms. Potter has done extremely well, whether we think we'll see some with similar conditions. But even if we see some with similar conditions, you will consider them, as I would, under whatever pieces of information, whatever policy, whatever considerations or issues you choose to bring to bear to those issues. Precedent, as you know, is a legal term. It has a lot of weight to it, and I would remind Council that you are not bound by it.
we are not bound by it. Thank you.
Okay. Councillor Lander.
Sorry to come around again. I know there are a lot of people waiting to go, but just trying to get the big picture in place here. I've not seen the model until tonight, and I'm trying to figure out where the cars would go in that model. You mentioned everything's above ground. Do they go under these?
They do. There's one access point, and it's...
I understand that, but
okay.
So they come out on McRae, and then they kind of go around the front, and each tucks in underneath?
Yes, they'd have each unit has an individual garage, but then there's a bank of visitor parking, and similarly on the building B, so that all of the parking is underground, accessed off of McRae, one access, and then it splits off. Is that right? Under the two different buildings. Okay.
Now the other thing is the 0.45 you mentioned, that is the allowable density, and that is what is being proposed, and you average it out over the 3 lots.
That's correct.
But the difference, I assume, is that there are a lot more people in this. That's the difference. The size of the built form is averaged out the same, but the number of people on the site will be quite a lot more than if you had 3 homes, or do you calculate so many people per home?
I mean, I guess you could, but no, you'd have, 3 single-family dwellings could also accommodate 3 legal suites. So at a minimum, you would have...
One per dwelling.
One per dwelling, that's
one
right.
Per dwelling.
One per dwelling, that's correct. So you could potentially have 6 families if you developed under current zoning. If you went the multiple conversion dwelling and infill route, I think we've counted that you could have 9 households by the time that panned out. So 4 households in the main house, 4 households in infill, and then 1 family dwelling down on the lower half of the lot.
So one of the issues that we're looking at here is this has got a lot of people, although the size of the buildings, the floor space used is not any different than what's allowed, but there's a lot more people and cars. Okay, thank you.
Councillor Chalice.
Yep. Hi, Ms. Potter. Regarding the 0.45 floor space ratio now, in the first Shaughnessy official development plan, I think the 0.45 is only 2/3 of it is above grade.
That's
right?
correct.
So now it's quite a departure on the CD1 that all of it is above grade, and I think that probably explains for the massive structure that we see in the model in terms of massing. Would you say that's the case because you're building on top of the 50-car garage?
Well, you do see more above grade than you would under existing zoning.
So would that be a fair assessment that is the same FSR as before on an average of 0.45?
No, and I did point that out in my opening, that is one of the key variances, is that all of the floor area would be above grade.
When it comes to traffic, somebody is going to speak to that, right?
We do have a member of our engineering staff here, and I believe the consultant who did the traffic study is also here. If you want to ask a question now.
Sure. Is there going to be any anticipated change to the intersection at Granville and 16th?
Not at this point. We are looking at normalization of Granville and 16th, but in future, not at this point.
You know, when you go down McRae Avenue, going downhill, you could only turn right there. So with 50 cars in the future, how are you going to manage the traffic there?
According to the transportation study, there are only 11 vehicles in AM peak hours and 13 vehicles in PM peak hours. So, though the parking is 50, so we are not expecting a lot of traffic because of this development, and we will be expecting that that much traffic would be totally unnoticeable.
So if you were coming up Granville Street driving south, right now you cannot turn left. Do you anticipate that to be the same? Or to
definitely
be changed?
the same.
So there's really a limited way for these people to get back into the parking lot.
Yes.
Yes. So I would anticipate in my mind that some money would have to be spent by the city in terms of re-engineering that traffic. It's not an easy place to be. Even if you were traveling on 16 going east, that you actually have to swing right over in order to get to McRae Avenue.
Yeah, we are looking into normalization of this intersection, and definitely in future.
But who's going to pay for that?
At this point, I cannot definitely say that who would be paying for that.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Anton?
Thank you, Your Worship. Councillor Ladner was trying to ask about the trees, and are there other presenters, or?
Yeah, I'm the only presenter from the staff team, but we have.
So if I might get the landscape.
Okay.
Person.
Okay. Do you want to do that as part of the applicant's presentation, or it doesn't matter to me?
Oh, the applicant is making a presentation.
Yes.
Okay, I'll wait then.
Okay. Sorry.
So why don't we have the applicant come now and present? Brian Bell.
Your Worship, members of council, my name is Brian Bell. I'm the president of the company that owns this property, and I'm here today to represent the company. I'm also here to represent myself as a 26-year resident of First Shaughnessy. I've lived there for the last 26 years, and the only house I've ever occupied. So I'm here for both purposes, but mainly, obviously, to talk to you about my proposal. And Vicky did a marvelous job of explaining the situation in technical detail, and it was very nicely presented. And I don't want to repeat information that's already been touched upon, but I did want to sort of give you a little bit of background about my reason for coming up with this proposal and my thinking as to why this thing would be a positive influence on the community and not a negative, and give you a little bit of history about what I've done before in support of that. I've been aware of the property, for a long time because it's quite prominent in Shaughnessy, and as I said, I've lived there for the last 26 years. And when I was made aware that the property was going to be up for sale, I contacted the owner, Peter Bentley, whose mother was the last member of his family to live in the house, and after she passed away, they decided to sell it. So I approached him, and I talked to him at length about my ideas, and he was quite supportive about my interest in saving the heritage house and doing something else with the property. So we struck a deal, and I bought the property and proposed a plan to the city shortly thereafter. This was around August of 2005. So it's going on the third year that we've been working on this, and we spent a lot of time and effort in trying to come up with a proposal that sort of meets the objectives of everybody concerned, whether it's myself as developer or the neighbors in the community or First Shaughnessy people or the city as a whole, with the direction that it's headed in the future. And as I said, we've spent a lot of time and given it a lot of thought and looked at a variety of options, and Vicky has mentioned a couple of different options that we looked at, and there's numerous ones that we're not going to talk about because they just weren't worth pursuing. But my original proposal, as some of you might have seen on the information that's presented in the documentation you've all received, there was a plan there that proposed moving the old Heritage House forward into the front part of the lot. As you probably realize, the house sits way back from the street, from the crescent, and most of the houses are quite close to the crescent. So my thought was, well, you could probably utilize some of that front yard. There's about 30,000 square feet of property in front of that house. It's a significant size front garden. And, I thought, well, it would be, better utilization of that portion of the property, set the Heritage House forward, and keep the look of the crescent, which is obviously very important. And the crescent is probably the premier address in First Shaughnessy, so it's obviously worth respecting. And so that was my first idea, and then I thought, well, in behind, we could sort of have a variety of housing types, infill type houses, maybe 3 or 4, and then working down to the bottom of the hill at Granville and 16th, something a little denser, reflecting the area that it is sitting in there, which is 16th and Granville, obviously a very busy intersection. There's Highcroft Towers there. There's the Highcroft Medical Center. There's another apartment building on the opposite corner. Highcroft University Women's Club is across the street there. So, as Vicki mentioned, it's a very unique location. And I thought, well, if there's a way to provide additional housing, some densification of a neighborhood, respecting all the characteristics of that neighborhood and trying to preserve as much as we can of that neighborhood, I thought this site had the most to offer, and I was very excited to be able to buy it and come up with some ideas to try and better utilize it, because that's my job. That's what I do, and that's what I like to do. And I'd like to do something that I feel is a bit more unique than just removing the old house and building mega houses there. That's just not really what I see as the best use of 2.3 acres in the heart of the city at the edge of Shaughnessy. So what you see before you here is the result of a lot of different meetings with staff and with neighbors and advisory panels, and we instituted this, the city instituted this co-design sessions that we had, and we sponsored and held a number of meetings and invited people to come and partake and give their opinions, and the plan actually changed dramatically from what was first presented as a result of all those meetings and all the input we received and took into consideration. And the result is what you see before you today. And it's still a work in progress. There's been some comments made about siting of certain parts of the building and other things that we've addressed and would address should this thing be approved. But we feel it's a reasonably decent use of a site that's currently not used for anything other than it's vacant. It's been vacant for 80 years. It's an anomaly in the city that land has sat there undeveloped. There's really no record of any house ever being on it, and it's an acre. It's about an acre lot, that one at the bottom of the hill. So, as I said, we developed this plan. I did another project some of you might be aware of 12 years ago now in Kerrisdale, 45th and McDonald on the corner. It was a very similar situation. There was a 1.3 acre site, had an old house that was heritage quality. It also straddled 2 of the 3 lots that comprised that site, and it had trees and compost and everything else just like this has as part of this site. And we went through the same sort of exercise, and the same situations occurred. We had meetings with the neighbors. People came, they gave their comments. There was, a big group of concerned residents who mounted a campaign to try and get the thing overturned. And, it was the same exact situation. I was successful in getting that approved. We rezoned the site there from RS, middle of Kerrisdale, to a CD1. And we developed same sort of circumstance. It was the same FSR that was allowed under the RS development. That's exactly what we put on there. It was infill houses. The Heritage House was saved and designated, and People are living there today happily in a very calm neighborhood. I think the neighbors are happy with what was done there, and I think the results speak for themselves. I've asked a couple of the people to come and speak to verify that and tell you what they think from their perspective, what the neighborhood thinks of the property. And so I felt that this was a very similar situation, and we could achieve the same sort of success with this property. And obviously the preservation of a Heritage A-listed house is very important, and without that, I know I wouldn't be standing here proposing this. So obviously it's a very key element of this project. I just wanted to reiterate that the density that we're talking about is 0.45 FSR overall on that 2.3 acre site. There's variances with the above grade square footage. Yes, I proposed that specifically because I felt that it was a better product at the end of the day to have your living space above grade, not in the basement. So that was one of the reasons we talked about the massing of the building, and I was concerned, that something to be built on that corner be prominent enough and not look like, undersized for the site or undersized for the area. We wanted to give it mass, enough mass to make it look substantial and fit in with the neighborhood there. And I think we've done that. So that's, as far as density goes, people say, 16 townhouses. Is 16 townhouses too much? Well, to be honest, 16 is a number that just sort of happened by accident. We took the square footage and we sort of divided it up. We crafted the building layouts and whatever. And I said to the architects, let's provide a variety of unit sizes, so we can accommodate smaller scale units. Our smallest scale unit now is about 1,200 square feet, and the biggest one is 3,500 square feet. So there's a range in between, and the number 16 resulted from a combination of a variety of different unit sizes to try and appeal to a broader range of prospective residents, and that's how that came about. As far as the parking is concerned, I know that's a big issue, and the traffic. We think that what we're proposing is a solution and not a problem. As you know, it's a very busy corner. Parking on Granville is not allowed for the most part, especially at the bottom of the hill where we are. Parking on McRae is limited to one side of the street only. There's no parking on our side of the street of McRae all the way up to the crescent, and it's a very steep hill, so access to the site is difficult. Now, my instructions to the architects when we developed this plan was make it work. I don't want to provide too little parking, so we could have enough parking for the residents. 2 cars per unit is sort of standard. That's 32 cars, say. I wanted to provide enough off-street parking so it doesn't add to the already problematic situation created by Highcroft. It's a commercial business they're running there. There's traffic there constantly. There's traffic parked there during the day. Their events generate traffic. I didn't want to impose a further traffic situation on the neighborhood by asking the residents to either park their vehicles on the street or ask their guests to park on the street. So we've allowed for extra parking to try and take that pressure off. And the notion of 50 cars coming and going all day long and creating a 50-car traffic jam there 24 hours a day, it doesn't make sense. Obviously, residents are parking their cars there. The hope is that because it's convenient as far as location to transit and walking distance to commercial areas, that people will park their cars there for the most part and not be driving them. If it's convenient, they'll take the transit, and I think that's another issue, a feature of this location that makes this a positive, not a negative. So as far as that 50 cars coming and going all day long, I just think that's a false statement. It's not going to be like that. The other thing, as far as the landscape, obviously the landscape is a concern to people. There's been a wooded lot there for the last 80 years, and trees have grown up wild. If anybody, I don't know if any of you took the time to actually walk the site or have a look inside, But I was there again yesterday with the landscape architect and our arborist just to have another walk through and assess the trees again. And for the most part, I mean, the trees are in very poor condition. Obviously, they provide sort of a grouping together that forms greenery on that corner, and there's no denying that. To try and salvage what's there, I've been through these things. I've been in this business for 30-odd years, and I've developed properties where we've had tree-cutting policies that we've given to developers of the houses for subdivisions where they can't cut trees. And you try and save every last tree, but, you know, it's difficult. When you have trees that have grown up like this together as a stand, if you start taking some out, and you have leaning trees and you have old trees and trees that haven't been looked after for 80 years, you have a danger situation as far as what are you going to expect? Are trees going to blow down? Year last Christmas, one of the trees did fall down and fell on the wires at 16th and Granville and knocked out the power to half of Shaughnessy. So it's an issue that has to be addressed, and it would be likely that most of those trees would be taken out should anything be developed there. And it is a building lot. It's not a park. It's not Stanley Park. It's not South Granville Park. It's a lot on the corner of 16th and Granville that just so happens to have never been built on all this time. It's odd, but that's the way it is. In any event, the proposal that you see before you here today is a distillation of all the information that we've received from our meetings and our discussions with members of staff who've been very supportive and very professional in the way they've dealt with me and the community, in my opinion. And I appreciate their support that they've given me. You know, coming into a meeting like this, a public hearing, it would be nice if all these neighbors were here to clap their hands, you know, and support me. Obviously, that's not the situation here. They have concerns, and their concerns obviously are valid, but I think their concerns are more out of fear of the unknown in the future and what this might do. Is this a precedent? Is Shaughnessy going to be ruined? I don't want to see Shaughnessy ruined either. I've lived there for 26 years. I plan to stay there for quite a few more years, I hope, and enjoy the community as well. So from that aspect, I'm trying to do the best job that I can to provide an interesting, unique form of housing, something that is a bit unique and different to the norm there. I think it's a better utilization of the site to provide densification and not just rely on 3 or 4 mega houses or whatever might be put onto the site. I just think that the salvation of the Heritage House and the addition of density to an unused site where we're not demolishing housing stock. It's an empty lot currently. We're adding to the housing stock that's available in a location that should make it very convenient for people to give up cars, take transit, walk, enjoy their neighborhoods. People I know have spoken to me over the last couple of years and said, you know, we had something like this in our community, we'd be happy to either come back or stay in Shaughnessy and downsize from our big houses. So I know there's a demand. I know that the concept is good. I made it work before in Kerrisdale. It certainly didn't ruin Kerrisdale. It's only been a positive addition there, and I feel that this certainly would be the same at the end of the day. And that's pretty much my spiel for the night. And if you have any questions, I'd be glad to answer them. And thank you for listening.
Thank you very much. Okay, we have speakers now. Oh, Councillor Anton.
Well, just hoping to hear from your landscape architect. Thank you, Mr. Bell, for your presentation.
I'm the landscape architect.
Mr. Sanga, thank you. If you wouldn't mind, it's actually Councillor Ladner's question from earlier about could you just give us a bit more on the trees that are there now and what they'll be replaced with, and will they be, how big will the new trees go? Will they obscure the buildings, or will the buildings show through, or? Is that, yeah, I don't know about the mic, is that?
I can speak about it from here then. In terms of the representation or the elevation, there was a bit of artistic license to reduce the amount of tree massing that we're actually proposing because the buildings wouldn't be visible at the end of it. The proposed trees that we've got are essentially red sunset maples that would bind all 16th and up onto Granville Street. And the red sunset maples are the same trees that are around the Robson Courthouse too. these trees will grow to being about 40 feet in height. What we've tried to do is go to primarily deciduous trees on that side, and then towards the south and towards the east to the adjacent property as well as to the heritage house, we've gone to a mixed variety of both conifers and deciduous trees. What I'm trying to do is to essentially create sort of a 40-foot height level so that I allow light to come into all the properties around it, including this one, but start to provide privacy in terms of the neighboring properties as well. So we are trying to select varieties of trees that are more limited in their size. The varieties are things like Vanderwolf pines and Serbian spruce and Japanese maples and cherry trees as they progress into the back of the property. And it's very much the intent that we create a park-like setting behind the development itself in terms of looking onto the water body as well.
So that's along 16th and along Granville, that's where the maples would be. And what about between the Heritage House and that sort of interior block of townhomes?
That's what we were proposing, that mix of conifers and deciduous trees.
Oh, that's in that area.
Yeah,
okay.
so what we were essentially trying to achieve is that when you're looking from the Heritage House down towards this portion of the development, you'd actually have a green belt you're looking onto. And what we're proposing to the south with the existing development that is there is the same kind of planting so that when the townhouse units are looking out towards the south, there's essentially a green belt there that would become a backdrop to the property. That would provide privacy as well for these units as well as the units to the south as well.
The Heritage House, I think those other properties were bought so the Heritage House could look out over, maybe out to the water, I guess. Is there a view from that Heritage House right now?
There's a bit of an ongoing joke with that. Sorry, what was the original name, Jim? It's supposed to be the house was named after its view to the water, but given the amount of high-rise development that's taken place there isn't that much of a view to the water anymore. There are sort of slots that are left. In fact, Highcroft Tower takes out a big chunk of it to the north itself.
And are there trees, the trees on those lower properties, the northerly properties, are they high enough that they block the view, or is the house itself high enough that it looks over them?
What's happened is, from what I could ascertain, there must have been a row of spruce trees that were planted at the edge of the property, and those trees are probably in the neighborhood of about 60 to 70 feet tall. So in themselves, what we're proposing is actually a bit shorter in height than that. But those trees also effectively block out whatever view that might remain up.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. So we'll go to the speakers now. First we have Richard Keat of the Vancouver Heritage Commission.
I have some maps if the city clerk could distribute. Thank you, Your Worship and Councillors. What I'm passing out is just to give you a sense of the background as we approach the co-design and to lead you through how we made our decisions. Shaughnessy, what you've got there are all the demolitions that have occurred in Shaughnessy since the ODP was passed. And on the east side of Shaughnessy, 22% of the heritage stock has come down. When I was asked to go on behalf of the Heritage Commission to the first co-design, it was with some trepidation because we've seen three different ways of demolishing a house in First Shaughnessy. First, of course, is demolition by neglect. The second one is demolition by consolidation, and that's where someone assembles several pieces of, or two pieces of property, and then applies to have the house demolished, and then they can go back and build a bigger house on the combined consolidated lots. You can look at the southeast corner of Angus and Granville, where that happened, where we had a wonderful heritage house that straddled two lots, and although staff were incredibly hardworking in trying to convince the owner to have infill, to give them all kinds of a manner of compensation, The owner decided to sell it as 2 legal lots, so we had the house demolished because the demolition, the subdivision, bylaw overrules heritage or the ODP in First Shaughnessy. And the house came down, and then the 2 legal lots were sold. They were consolidated, and now we have an 18,000 square foot house going up there, where there was a wonderful heritage house that could have easily been massaged into a terrific house with 2 infills. The third thing we see is subdivision. There have been a number of properties where subdivision has been enacted. Although it's true that none of the A-listed houses have come down, those of you who have been around will remember in the early 90s that 1037, which is now 1083 Matthews, close to, right at the corner of Wolf and Matthews, was bought when the market was down by an owner who wanted to demolish one of the A houses with a big craftsman. And after a very rancorous and expensive debate with council and public meetings, the city offered him a subdivision which was really not in character, and certainly in the goals of the ODP, it states specifically that we are to discourage subdivision. So we managed to save that one. But it was with this idea of all the demolition that we've looked at and the fact that this was so much more valuable consolidated as a parcel of land that we came to the first co-design meeting. And we were a little bit surprised to see that the first solution was to move the Heritage House forward up to the Crescent. And as anyone in Heritage will tell you, the international rule, the first principle, is you don't move a house in situ if it's in good shape and it's well maintained, which this certainly was, both inside and out. Secondly, what makes this house really spectacular is the front garden. It's a Jekyll design. The house is based on lichens. It's been on the cover of Heritage Canada, the national magazine. It's really what makes the whole place unique. It's drawn throughout the First Shaughnessy design guidelines. And so I was happy to sort of ask that we could look at ways that we could keep the Heritage House in situ, because if we moved it suddenly, there's more than substantial renovation, we would require rain screening, which would tear up the outside. We would require sprinklering and code requirements, which would tear up the inside. End of Heritage House, end of Heritage Garden. So to his credit, the developer, who lives in a heritage house himself that's been very sensitively expanded, came back to the second meeting with the house in situ. And then the problem arose is, what is appropriate compensation? Compensation, as I'm sure you know, is provincially mandated, and it is in just about every area jurisdiction in North America, that there has to be compensation if there's designation. And what's remarkable about this is that we not only get designation of the house, we get designation of landscape, which is really, after all, 50% of the value and character of Shaughnessy. To that end, we went then with what came out. I was not, unfortunately, at the November 19th meeting of the Heritage Commission. And by the way, it wasn't unanimous as far as the Heritage Commission voting in favor of the project as presented. Our representatives, our liaison from the Vancouver Heritage Commission to the First Shaughnessy Advisory Design Panel, Judith Hanson, voted against it. And basically because of the amount of density that was being given. We took our figures from I believe it was the Urban Design Panel that had passed it, and our mandate is really to look out for the heritage, and we were happy with what we were getting, and we hope that what would go to Mr. Bella's compensation would be appropriate but not excessive. We did also note, quite honestly, at one of the co-design meetings that there are other CD1 properties in line with that. When the University Women's Club was developed in Highcroft, the old swimming pool pavilion that's to the east was restored and surrounded with 9 co-op townhouses, which have been very successful, known as McRae News. To the west on Granville and 16th, there's a multifamily 3-story walk-up apartment. So on that lower elevation, there is, by and large, multifamily dwellings close by. And even to the south of this proposal, there is 5 Cedars, which is multiple conversion with an infill. So it's not surrounded by single-family houses. They've also brought up the parking garage, and
Have to summarize.
okay,
summarize.
There's another parking garage roughly the same size underneath the Chinese consulate, which is 2 doors up. Finally, we would just like you to listen to Mr. Spaxman, who was the author of the ODP, along with Joyce Catlett and the executive of Chapeau, and perhaps look at Block B and whether it really works with this concept.
Thank you very much.
I have a question. Thank you, Mr. Keat. I'm just interested in what you're talking about in the context of other areas which have legislation like this. You said this was provincially mandated. Are you talking about through the Vancouver Charter, or are you talking about through provincial legislation?
I think it's through the Vancouver Charter.
That allows this to happen. Or maybe
I think when the HRA, the Heritage Revitalization Agreement legislation came through, that was the province made that happen, and in that was compensation.
Right. I think that's through the Vancouver Charter, though, rather than through provincial legislation. Well, the Vancouver Charter is provincial legislation, but applies to the City of Vancouver, yes.
Right.
Okay. And you said other jurisdictions have a similar kind of provision?
Generally, not for residences, but generally there's compensation. The great thing in the United States is that you can get a 20% tax credit on heritage buildings that are not residential but commercial, institutional.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you for your presentation.
Next speaker is Ray Spaxman.
Your Worship, members of Council, I'm Ray Spaxman. I live at 2144 Nelson Avenue, West Vancouver, and I'm a planning consultant representing a number of Shaughnessy residents who oppose the rezoning as proposed and see a better way of achieving the private purpose of making a profit and the public purpose of preserving Nickel House and doing more to preserve the uniquely valuable character of First Shaughnessy. My first task before I accepted the invitation to advise the residents was to look at the proposal and wonder if I had a role, or was this just another thoughtless NIMBY action. After all, I have a long history of involvement in the creation of policies, guidelines and processes concerning the development of the city. I remember well the pride we all felt in the community when Council enacted those innovative policies for Shaughnessy, protecting it further from further dismemberment by inappropriate developments, and establishing some of the first, what we might call, eco-density policies anywhere, permitting sensitive infill and the insertion of in-character multiple dwellings. It's no accident that these days Shaughnessy has to be protected from the tour bus operators who wish to show the world this beautiful, historic, inner-city residential area, and is constantly visited by planners and architects finding out how to design successful infill housing. So what was my first reaction? It was shock and disappointment. Surely the cost of keeping one of the most beautiful old mansions, and I might say one of the better kept ones too, and its garden should not mean 150 yards of sinuous 2 to 3 story faux classical townhouses, too tightly packed on the site, too pushed up against the main facade of the Nickel House, and to boot, altering this marvellous interface between the wooded Shaughnessy mansions and the very urban Fairview district with its vibrant Granville shopping mall. So I took on the role of finding out why. I've submitted 5 reports with numerous issues, which I can't go into tonight, to the uniquely informative and objective community website created by one of the neighbours, which I hope councillors have had the opportunity to see. And because it's impossible to deal with the issues in 5 minutes, several of the neighbours have arranged tonight to pick up different points of view, so there's no repetition, but there's a lot of points of view to deal with. And I would like to come back and finish
more detailed presentation if there is time at the end of the public hearing, because I need to take 5 minutes at this time. My first task was to find out what had been going on for the previous 2 years and what the reasons were for the proposed form of development. Key to this is the pro forma, which shows how the compensation in the form of density allowed on the CD1 portion of the site was established. You will hear more about that unnecessary, awkward and secretive process later, but it has taken my clients many thousands of dollars of several consultants' time to establish that the development proposed could be reduced to close to a third using the city's formulas, but allowing the developer a 15% profit while using our appraisers' advice on property values. So the debate about the pro forma is going to be big, and you'll hear discussions about the science of it, and I would like to talk about the art of it as well at some moment. Given more concern for preserving the first Shaughnessy district character and this major heritage mansion, and in the context of this remarkable time we're in Vancouver, when property values are skyrocketing, when the value of this property has probably doubled in the last 3 years, there must be a more sensitive way of developing this site than the one displayed in this application. Perhaps if we had the benefit of looking carefully at more relevant alternatives, we would be in a better position to advise Council what other alternatives should be considered. We have not seen analysis of the more valuable and valid alternatives. We do know at least that the townhouses should be reduced from 16 to 11 in number and distributed more sensitively on the site, providing a more comfortable and neighbourly relationship with Nickel House and a more Shaughnessy district appearance at the Granville corner. In that respect, I ask that if Council considers approving this application, it does so while revising the conditions of approval by reducing the number of townhousing units to 10 and removing the 5 units backing on the Nickel House. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is Laurie.
Sorry, I had a question.
Councillor Anton.
Thank you, Mr. Saxon. On the pro forma, you say the value's doubled in 3 years. I guess when these numbers started first, you're referring back to when our staff first started crunching these numbers, that the values have gone up in that time?
We will have a detailed presentation on the numbers, but just broadly, I think the house was, the 3 lots were bought for $7 million originally several years ago, and are now worth more than 12, as I understand it.
Could I just ask staff if you could respond to the increase in value and how that affects the pro forma over the last couple of years?
Yes. Well, essentially, when we're reviewing it now, we're looking at all those values now. So there may not be substantial difference in terms of the actual compensation that you would be providing the developer. If you're assuming that all the variables have risen equally over that period of time.
Did you do that recalculation then?
Yes, we did.
Okay. And so the result of your recalculation?
We came to the same conclusion.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Mr. Spexman? So what do you figure the market value per square foot would be for these townhouses in your estimate?
I wonder if we could leave that, Your Worship, until there's a presenter who is going to present the pro forma issue.
Okay.
That would be preferable, I think.
Sure. Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. Great. Okay, next speaker is Laurie Kozub, followed by Bob Hodgkinson.
Thank you, everybody, for hosting us tonight on Valentine's Day. My name is Laurie Kozub, and I'm an owner at 3437 Osler in First Shaughnessy. I'm a member of the First Shaughnessy Design Advisory Panel, and I sit on the Shaughnessy Home Property Owners Association. I do not support any part of this rezoning application. First Shaughnessy is special because of its heritage and character. There are very few areas in the world like First Shaughnessy. It needs to be retained and protected, like other major Canadian cities protect their heritage neighbourhoods, examples like Rosedale and Westmont. The First Shaughnessy Official Development Plan, which everybody is referring to as ODP, was created over 25 years ago with the intention to keep the beauty and the uniqueness of the area for today, but also for future generations of this community. I believe in the past years, the City of Vancouver and its residents have worked hard to adhere and implement this plan. Needless to say, I was very disappointed about the City recommending this proposal for consideration. In my opinion, this public hearing should not be about how many townhouses should be built. There should be no townhouses built as stated in the ODP. Any new buildings approved need to be in the character for Shaughnessy, that being infills or smaller homes in the back properties. They should be properly spaced, classically designed, and carry the grace of the rest of the neighborhood. The project needs to follow the first Shaughnessy official development plan. It is not up to the community to forsake our single-family historic neighborhood to ensure that somebody makes an acceptable profit using the pretext of saving the nickel home. The request for spot zoning is detrimental to the overall well-being of First Shaughnessy and will have lasting effects on future rezoning requests. In my opinion, if approved, this will open the floodgates for all types of rezoning initiatives. If this is passed, it will be precedent-setting, and the next rezoning applications will be much easier for the city to pass. City planning states this is unique circumstances, so everyone will have unique circumstances and find a special situation. Then what kind of historical neighborhood are we going to have? Consequently, I believe the ODP needs to be reinforced. I want to make you aware that in the city planning report, it states the First Shaughnessy Advisory Panel approved this project. In my opinion, when the project was presented to the panel, there was not adequate time for the discussion regarding the impact of the rezoning on the neighborhood and how the project goes well beyond the ODP guidelines. Throughout these 3 meetings, the majority of time was spent on the townhome design, resulting in little more than minor changes each time the applicant returned. It should be noted that the last meeting, the motion to approve was passed by 1 vote, 5-4. All 4 who were opposed were Shaughnessy residents. I believe this project was not evaluated objectively by the panel in its entirety. Finally, it bothers me to have this threat by city planning and the developer that the home will be torn down at the detriment of the rest of the neighborhood. If this is a moment in truth, and this is definitely not my first choice, but I would rather see that torn down and replaced with 3 beautiful quality single homes, and at least the ODP would remain intact, and the single-family home character of the neighborhood would be maintained. If this rezoning is approved, considering the current proposal, the heritage character of the Nickel House will be lost anyhow. What will it look like? An upgraded, newly designed Heritage A home with a superseded rose garden, because the rose garden doesn't exist anymore. In the backyard, somewhere between 32 to 65 feet from the back of the Nickel House, 16 faux heritage townhomes stuffed into a newly created CD1 lot, which at one time was part of the beautiful estate. The rezoning project will not maintain the characteristics of the neighborhood and will be everlasting, and in my opinion, a bit of an eyesore for the heritage aspect. I ask Council to turn down this rezoning proposal in total. The right project for 1402 needs to adhere to the ODP that's well thought out and add value and the continued beauty in First Shaughnessy.
No question from Councillor Capri? No. Okay. Councillor Chow?
Yes. Ms. Calls-up, you mentioned it went through 3 meetings with the First Shaughnessy Advisory Design Panel, and so I gather there are 9 persons on the panel, right?
There were actually more, but that was the attendees for that meeting.
So, and you said the 4 residents were opposed and 5 were for, and where were the other 5 in terms of where their profession or department were stemmed from?
Well, the other architects, landscape architects, 2 architects, and a person from real estate.
Okay, sure. So, in your mind, then, for Shaughnessy, really, it's not just the buildings; it's the complete grounds and the single-family character houses. That would be
it's the overall package of the whole beautiful neighborhood.
So, if I ask you, would you save the house at any price? What would you say? No. Thank you.
Councillor Anton?
Thank you. I turn to you. Thank you for coming, Ms. Kozub, and to our staff. There are different policies here in the First Shaughnessy District Shaughnessy official development plan does talk about, it has a lot of emphasis on single family, but it seems to have even more of an overall emphasis on heritage. And maybe from our staff, can I just get what are the primary principles here that are at play? And maybe Ms. Kozub, you could answer the same question. But I mean, what's the reason for this whole first Shaughnessy plan?
I don't know if I can be heard clearly across the room there, but the main goal of the plan is fairly well stated within it. It's to preserve and protect Shaughnessy's unique pre-1940 character. Part of the incentives offered to do so are the introduction of alternative forms of housing. I don't think you have to stretch very far to see that the plan contemplates different forms of housing, so long as the goal of preserving meritorious houses is met.
Thank you. So I guess there's sort of it seems to, what the staff are saying is that the point of the plan is to preserve heritage. So if you're actually taking out the heritage, then you actually lose the point of the plan.
There's lots of different ways to preserve the heritage. And for example, we live in a big pre-1940s home that's been converted into a duplex, and we have 2 infills in the back. It's an absolutely beautiful place to live. That's the kind of thing I'm talking about.
Just get slightly closer to the mic, please.
That's the thing I'm talking about, where those are the alternatives, as I'm referring to as infills. There's alternatives to keep the natural look of the historic part. Townhouses weren't part of First Shaughnessy in pre-1940s. That was my point of you can do things from a development perspective but still maintain the look and characteristic of First Shaughnessy pre-1940s.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bob Hodgkinson. Bob Hodgkinson, followed by Rosemary Barron Swingle.
Thank you. I'm Bob Hodgkinson, and I've been a resident of Shaughnessy for 12 of the last 17 years, and I'm currently an owner of my 3rd home in Shaughnessy during that period of time on Oster Street. Developed under the first Shaughnessy official development plan.
Could you please speak into the mic?
Certainly. Okay. Personally speaking, the major reasons that I find Shaughnessy an attractive place to reside is naturally the serenity of the area and the proximity to city life in Vancouver. Another really important reason is that there is a written understanding amongst the residents and the city as to the underlying guidelines that effect and assure a development policy that ensures uniform treatment of each of the properties, underlying requirement for consistently valued real estate, which has been in place, I think, since about 1982. Incorporated into the ODP are well thought out and, more importantly, mutually agreed eco-density provisions that are relatively uniform to all of the properties and, most importantly, accepted by the area owners. A small but important compensation for the taxes that we pay. The proposed redevelopment at McRae, as interesting as it is from an architectural point of view, and as much as we would like to see a developer prosper in any respect of significant effort, in my opinion, flies squarely in the face of the intent of this seasoned and accepted plan. And I, like many others, and which is quite contrary because I make my profession as a contrarian usually, believe that the extent of the consideration being proposed by the city to such a rezoning application is against all the best long-term interests of any landowner in the area, save perhaps the developer. We all understand that the advantages of additional tax base and transposing the cost of replacing aging infrastructure, but that, I think, is a very short-term consideration here. The written response from the City Planning Department I thought was very weak at best justification of the economic approval for this particular plan. It's nothing more than a defensive exercise in the response to opposition from an ill-focused enthusiasm, speaking personally, from the planning department in this particular case. The laws of economics, be what they may, the revenue side of that equation is grossly minimized in today's marketplace. Furthermore, any response seen today doesn't seem to really address the major insult of this application, and that is to ask the city for approval under the threat of demolishing a vintage home if not approved. This, to me, lacks integrity and smacks of politics. The house. I drive past this house every day. Okay, it has definitely seen better years as a single residence, although the current residents have done a very good job. It is a building of some architectural and perhaps considerably more historical value, but it is not without major restoration to bring what is basically a drafty and technically dodgy old place back into the 21st century. The idea of a $1.4 million makeover is nothing but lipstick in this particular case. And the Heritage Rose and the Heritage Garden really hasn't been seen for several years as important a piece of part of that property as I think it is. There are many combinations of redevelopment available here, in my opinion, that if possible should save the face and improve the livability of such a residence. But to have the city consider approving a total FSR anything close to the density that is proposed for 45,000 square feet that we've been hearing, with townhouse developments in addition to the main home, just to keep it as is, where is to me morally and fundamentally wrong. Better the house be torn down, the rights of the area residents preserved, and not be compromised, and the developer be limited to building whatever the first Shaughnessy official development plan has already authorized. Two interesting observations have come out of this application.
Please summarize, sir,
I am. The first is that an otherwise disparate group and private group of people have actually come together to voice their common concern about this application, which I know is against the individual nature of the majority of them. And two, we as taxpayers and area residents have had to spend our private time and our private capital to hopefully displace this particular agenda in an effort to ensure adherence and existing well-thought-out and well-functioning City of Vancouver area-specific bylaws that are already in place.
Thank you.
My hope is that this serves to strengthen the argument against this application. Thank you.
Rosemary Baron Swingle. No. Paul G. Swingle. Are you Rosemary Baron? Okay.
Good evening, Your Worship, members of council, and Rosemary Baron Swingle. Sorry, is that better?
No.
Is that better? Again, good evening, Your Worship, members of council. My name is Rosemary Baron Swingle, and I'm the proprietor of Baron's Art Gallery in Gastown. And as of 5 o'clock this evening, I am the new owner of 3290 Granville, which is placing me in the unique position of being a brand new neighbor in a mansion that was converted in 1977 called the Five Cedars, which we have nicknamed today the Valentine House, and has been divided into four, including the carriage house. This house, which I think is very interesting historically, and particularly interested this evening, because despite years as a rental accommodation, this 1911 Spanish mission-style mansion was in excellent condition when a Vancouverite purchased it during the late 1970s. The structural work required to convert it from a single-family residence into a 3-story luxury condominiums was fairly straightforward, but dealing with City Hall in order to start the project rolling was not. And I find myself this evening on the opposite end of the spectrum. That City Hall, excuse me, am I correct in calling you City Hall, the plan is in favor of this, where it seems like the neighborhood is against it. And for labeling myself as no other this evening than the devil's advocate, I would like to make a couple of statements. As I mentioned, I'm a brand new owner as of 5 o'clock this evening. And because of that, I had to do what I consider to be investigative journalism regarding this proposal, reading 100 pages plus, calling and speaking to people within the immediate neighbor as best as I could, hearing their sides and positions. I met with officials in planning, and most recently Brian Bell and his team of architects. Rumors and misinformation abounded during my investigation. Brian Bell and his architectural team dispelled these rumors and misinformation. I have walked the subject property and found falling elders, thicket bushes, scrub brush, and no one has mentioned the vagrants living on the property. Basically, much room for improvement. On a very busy corner, as a direct neighbor within a fence line where the property will be built approximately 20 and I hope 40 feet from that fence line, I have found Mr. Bell to consider such important things as vistas, increased vehicular traffic, including the parking facility, and we even discussed the large grouping of cedars on the top of the property, and I found him very open-minded and taking my concerns and those of Shaughnessy's into consideration. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Paul G. Swingle, followed by Patty Gaynor.
Your Worship, councillors, as my wife said, folks have been talking about living in Shaughnessy for 26 years, and we've been there 5 hours. So my opinions are clearly not seasoned. But I'm here purely on a personal level in terms of expressing some of my concerns. The first thing that hit me when I looked at the proposal was that what we were exposed to, and we are the property with the greatest impact associated with this, is that we were faced with a density of 40% above code. The second thing that concerned me was the one large unit that people seem to be concerned about, I think it's called Block B, is going to be about 6.5 meters from the property line and right in the direct line of view. And I know other people are going to speak to the Block B concerns about the vista of the Nickel House and so forth. We spoke, as my wife said, with Mr. Bell and his staff, and they seemed very sensitive to our concerns. One of the things they mentioned was planting things, and some other people have mentioned this as well, that would mature over time. And I'd like to point out that at my age, I don't buy green bananas. So there is an issue associated with what is this going to look like immediately upon completion. As I indicated, my views are not seasoned because I'm just new at having a look at the potential impact on us as we move into this area. And I just wanted to express my concern about Block B, but also to reiterate what my wife said, that we found Mr. Bell and his staff very agreeable and open to our concerns. Thank you.
Thank you. Next is Patty Gaynor, followed by Doug Leard.
Good evening, Mayor Sullivan, councillors, and invited guests. My name is Patty Gaynor. I own a company called Patty Gardens that does fine gardening and design. And I have 7 clients in the First Shaughnessy District. Correction, First and Second District. My clients will tell you that my specialty is sightlines, as they are constantly being asked, what do you see from your favorite chair when you have breakfast, when you have your cup of coffee? When you have your guests over for dinner, what are they looking out on? Do they like what they're seeing? Or are you a little embarrassed? As I look at the sight lines from a great number of vistas, from the Swingles master bedroom and bathroom, it will be right in line with the Block B homes. The people on the Crescent, Block B, is going to have a large impact. I often ask, when you sit in the shade on a hot day, is that what you're looking at? Is that what you like? Would you like it changed? Each of us is growing and changing every minute, as cities are growing and changing. This week has been an incredible week for Vancouver, since we had thousands of press people in regarding the Olympics. When listening to the neighbors and the lot closest to Granville Street, so I'm going to call it Lot 3, this lot with the trees, etc. on it is in a process of change. And as Mr. Sangha can attest to, we have mostly alders, which are the cover that grow first to allow the small conifers to begin to grow. And in that in the process of them growing and getting big, and at this point getting ugly and dying, is exactly what they're supposed to be doing to allow the conifers now to have sunshine and continue to grow. But this process is going to take another 20 years, so that in 20 years we'll have lovely conifers on that corner. And there's times that, as Dr. Swingle mentioned, that I don't eat green bananas. I don't know that many of my clients are ready to plant the little tiny boxwood, hoping that we're going to have a 12-foot boxwood hedge. No, they say, Patty, go find me a 12-foot boxwood hedge. Just like the only thing that we have to live with is we have to grow and enjoy our 13-year-olds becoming adults. So we'll put that time in, and at some point they're going to become good people. We just have to go through the process. This piece of property, I believe, is in need of having significant landscaping done on it. I am not at all happy with what is going to happen with Block B. That, to me, is destroying too many sight lines.
Summarize now.
I am extremely happy to hear that there is a covenant on the property that's going to keep, if we go this route, there is a covenant on that property so that it can't be torn down. And I'm happy to hear that we have parking for cars, and I'm going to assume bicycles. But I am truly concerned with what is here and what the sight lines are going to be for the neighbors. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next speaker is Doug Laird, followed by Frank Shorrock.
Good evening. My name is Doug Laird. I'm a resident of Brian Bell's development of 45th and McDonald, and I've lived there since the home was originally built. So I'm not here to talk about this specific project, but just to provide some feedback 12 years later on a similar controversial project where there was a lot of concern in the neighborhood about what the change meant. I'm born and lived within a mile of the place that I live, so always have concern about change in the neighborhood. Over the last 12 years, having lived there, I've never heard a negative comment about the development once. All I've ever heard is positive feedback about how wonderful the project turned out and how well it fits into the neighborhood. And we actually built the house on the property and bought it directly from Brian. So I had a lot of interaction with him through building and through his development of the rest of the project. And for what it's worth, I'd just like to, report to other concerned neighbors that Brian lived up to his word. He was always very sensitive to our concerns as residents on the property. He continued to develop on spec the rest of the property, and as I say, he lived up to or exceeded our expectations. So if there's worries about that, I'd suggest that that's not an issue, and as I say, it's more of feedback of a similar project 12 years later.
Okay, thank you very much. Frank Shorrock, followed by Harrison Cito.
Your Worship, members of Council, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Frank Shorrock, and I am the President of the Shaughnessy Heights Property Owners Association, SHPOA. The streetscape in this area was laid out by the Danish engineer L.E. Devok and the Montreal landscape architect Frederick Todd. 3 lots were purchased to complement the house, giving privacy, preventing intrusion, and allowing the house, built on the rise, to have an unrestricted view of the city, its inlets and North Shore Mountains. And incidentally, if you go upstairs, you can see the North Shore Mountains and some of the inlets. The house was designed in 1912 by the architect Samuel McRae and his partner C.C. Fox. The property has remained undisturbed for nearly 100 years, and this is your once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to leave the property complete for the benefit of the people of Vancouver. Once it is gone, and that is it. There were a number of meetings in late 2006 with the developer and his architect, city staffers, neighbours and interested parties. The first comment I remembered from the developer was, "I can pull down the house and build 3 monster homes." After 4 meetings, a proposal was made for 16 townhouses, which I think even the most ardent supporter of the townhouses never envisaged. 16 was with no knockback by planning whatsoever. Their report to council mentioned substantial council policy to support. Arc's vision supports this. Well, really? Fair compensation, unnecessary hardship, unusual profit. In January, Council called for the public to receive a limited analysis of the developer's pro forma related to the heritage compensation. This report pointed out that the developer, quote, would be way better off financially by demolishing the heritage home and constructing 3 or more Shaughnessy estate-like houses, end quote. Obviously room for movement here. The report further states that the land value across the site is a material fact and values the 4,043 square feet on the Granville site at $51 per square foot. Quote, the significant decrease in land value associated with the Granville Street frontage vis-à-vis a quieter internal Shaughnessy Street address, end quote. $51 a square foot, a material fact. Let's look at a few facts. Right across the street, 1542 West 16th, $124 a square foot. 1511 Marpole, $91 a square foot. 3335 Granville, $96 a square foot. Kitty Corner, the commercial property, $439 a square foot. A value of $51 a square foot, a material fact. Quote, staff has followed proper urban land economic principles, the city heritage policies and guidelines, and bona fide third-party appraisals, all in accordance with the established city policies. A value of $51,000 a square foot. Where else in the city, I ask, can you find land at this value? Oh, it's off the microphone. 2700 Block West 12th, $249 a square foot. 4000 Block West 35th, $292. 1100 East 21st, $170. Brant Street, Norquay, $143. Nanaimo, $107. Rupert, $123. East 12th, $73 a square foot. There appears to be a number of anomalies which bring into question the credibility of the whole report. The Shore Board has resolved the subdivision of the heritage site should not be allowed. The rezoning of a portion of the heritage site and the rezoning of the adjacent lot should not be permitted. That the preservation of the Nicole House on the heritage site and the development of its adjacent empty lot should adhere strictly to the SSODP and the First Shaughnessy guidelines.
Summarize. You need to summarize. Or you can come back at the end and speak further.
Council should heed the concern of the residents of First Shaughnessy and community and reject the proposed rezoning. Thank you.
Sorry, I've got a question. Mr. Shark, I just have a quick question for you. Thanks very much for coming out. Your opening comments, you made the statement that this is your opportunity to leave the property complete. Can you help me understand how that will happen if we turn down this application?
Well, you could put sort of 4 apartments in the main house, and you could have 2 houses down below with a couple of infills. I mean, planning said that you would be better off having 3 homes on their own, so they would know.
Okay, that's not what my understanding was, so maybe I can ask Ms. Potter, because just to clarify, because what I understood was that if we turn this down, then there is the potential that the house will be demolished and that there would potentially be 3 mansions put there.
Well, no, you could leave the old house where it is, add some apartments in it.
Okay, maybe I can just turn to Ms. Potter to clarify, because I understood that might not be our options then.
It is an option, isn't it?
I'd like to, I'll start, but I'd like to rely on the assistance of our real estate staff as well. It's my understanding that any option using the multiple conversion dwelling infill, which is something available through the ODP, didn't pan out financially for this site. And part of it has to do with where the building sits, straddling the 2 lots. And of course, the desire to keep the front yard. Jerry, do you want to supplement that?
I would agree with Vicky. Certainly, the requirement to preserve the landscaping at the front elevation of. I'll try again. The requirement to preserve the landscaping at the front elevation of Nickel House would make that very challenging from an economic point of view to provide enough compensation to the developer.
So therefore, I think when I said earlier that one option would be to just put 3 large mansions on each of the 3 lots, that assumed having to demolish the one that straddles the 2 lots. It would be 3 new mansions. And I believe that is a financially viable option. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Chow?
Just following up on the options of 3 houses or whatever. Did the city confer with the developer on the pro forma statement that some of the ones that are not viable and some of the ones are viable, like you just said? Were there financial pro forma produced for those options?
The developer presented us with various pro formas for various options. And what kind of market value or value do you use for that kind of pro forma, like dollar per square foot at selling price? Well, it very much depends on which form of development we're talking about.
Mm-hmm. So let's say for single detached development, like some of these examples that were shown in the report, how much would that be?
Well, once again, I mean, there was various options that were presented. Some are.
How much was the pro forma figure that were used in our yellow memo, for example? Let's start with that, the townhouses.
Are you talking about sales revenues?
Yes. Well, yeah. I guess in order to get a figure as to how much we should compensate the developer, there must be cost and also revenue. So I'm talking about in terms of revenue side, how much are you assuming when you're selling the townhouses? You know, $500 per square foot, $800, $1,000, $1,200. You know, what figure we use in a pro forma statement?
Well, we actually advised. We met with representatives.
No, I mean the yellow memo that we got from the real estate department.
Yes.
Yes. What figure were used?
That information isn't in there. But that's the
it's not in there. I'm just asking.
Well, that was based on the original 2006 pro forma analysis.
And 2006. So how much was that? 2006.
Well, that information formed part of the pro forma that the developer provided us with. So that is confidential information.
Okay. Thank you.
Councillor Anton. Okay. Next speaker is Harrison Cito, followed by Greg Moe.
Your Worship, members of the Council, my name is Harrison Cito, and I have been born and raised in Vancouver. And at this moment, I'm quite fortunate to be living at the coach house of the University Women's Club property. So the Nickel House, 1402 McRae, they're my neighbors to my west. And so as someone born in Vancouver, I've seen a little change in Vancouver since my birth. One of my first memories of development was when my family and we lived on Gravely Street near Clark Drive, the east side. And it was all single housing at the time, and we had a nice gravel alleyway. And across the way was another single house property with a magnificent cherry tree. Magnificent cherry tree that provided cherries, fruit, and shade in the summer, and a platform for swing for the children. And of course, the progress of development came along, and a few lots got bought up and amalgamated, and a 3-story building got put in. So goodbye cherry tree, and also goodbye view of Grouse Mountain for our family. So here, it seems to me that the developer has been doing due process, and it seems to be a very considerate person, a lot of experience developing and dealing with neighbors, and so I think he's a very sensitive person to listen to the folks. And we have a responsibility to hopefully provide a profitable endeavor for the developer. I just can't imagine how it cannot be profitable, I guess. Having bought a property in First Shaughnessy, then to me it somehow automatically translates, wow, he bought it a few years ago and now the value is like so much. How can this person not make a profit? I would advise, my view is for the council to turn down this application. During the summertime, what I see going down McRae Avenue are these tour buses. These tour buses, I think, oh, look, a tour bus coming down McRae Avenue. Why are they coming down? And they're coming down because there's something special and unique about First Shaughnessy. And the visitors to Vancouver, they want to have a look at what is this magnificence of First Shaughnessy. I do not believe that this proposed development of 16 townhouses will add to the character, the heritage of First Shaughnessy. I don't believe the 16 townhouses will add to the tourism draw of First Shaughnessy. There's a saying about something is a dime a dozen. I could say townhouses are a dime a dozen, but in Vancouver's real estate market, it's more like $1 million or $2 million each. The developer said that the lot's not doing anything right now. And we also heard that the city wants to protect our valuable heritage resources. And I think maybe there's an assumption heritage means property, man-made buildings. But I'd like the council to also consider that heritage can also include our natural heritage. So those trees might have been naturally grown in or planted, but they are serving some purpose. I'm not an ecological expert, so I'm sure someone could explain better than I, but I'm sure it's providing a benefit of clean air and moderating the climate around that busy corner, and also providing kind of a calming, harmonizing effect. So,
to summarize.
Okay, and I'd like to come back.
You come back? Okay.
Yes.
We'll put your name down at the end.
Thank you. So instead of the proposed plan, I would like to see 2 infills like coach house. I live in the coach house. I love living in the coach house. I imagine anyone who buys a coach house property would love living in the coach house. Keep the Nickel House there. Keep the Rose Gardens there. Keep the 3238 Granville there, wooded. And after the development of the 2 coach houses and the sale of the 2 coach houses, the developer can donate the wooded lot to a land conservation organization and have a tax benefit.
Thank you very much. Greg and Mo. followed by Alan Askew.
Good evening, Your Worship, members of council, fellow attendees. My name is Greg Moe. I'm a resident at 3838 Cypress Street. I'm both a licensed and practiced professional engineer and a professional accountant. By application, my wife and I are local business owners in Vancouver. We've been residents in the city for 45 years, and for all of that time, we've either lived in First Shaughnessy or an immediately adjoining community. In late 1999, my wife and I purchased the Greencroft estate. This is a Grand Heritage A-listed property that had sadly fallen into a protracted state of disrepair. It was an historic property because it had been built by Eric Camber and his wife in and around 1912, 1913. It served as the Lieutenant Governor official residence when Hamber had held those offices in the 1930s and early 40s. Over the subsequent 5 years after acquisition, my wife and I saved and completely restored the original 17,000 square foot mansion into 2 beautiful living units, reduced in size, but with floor plans that were sensitive to the original layout and features. In addition, 2 other infills were constructed on the property. As a result of participating in this process, we have direct personal experience in negotiating HRA designations and related preservation agreements, bonus density arrangements, and stakeholder consultation processes that existed back in 2000 and 2001 in respect of gaining support and acceptance for such a high-profile development. Accordingly, we feel particularly qualified to make relevant comments and draw meaningful comparisons to issues surrounding the current application for the preservation of the Nickel Heritage residence. Further, we care deeply and are passionate about the preservation of the estate-like feel of this very special neighborhood in which we've chosen to live. I'd like to focus my remarks to council primarily on the area of financial comparatives, as I believe I may be the only one in possession of such information who is in opposition to the current scheme. Mr. Spaxman started out earlier talking about the concept of responsible community development. More pointedly, what that means is that there's a strong argument to be made that the current application should relax the magnitude of its compensation request and accede to the elimination of the row of 5 townhouses, this Block B, which townhouses are singly the largest and most obviously recognized design flaw in the current scheme. The reason this should be done is that the applicant has already benefited from a lift in the fair market value of the underlying land in the magnitude of approximately $5 million. Would it not be reasonable, responsible, and community-minded for the applicant to forgo the incremental profit on 5 titles to appease the First Shaughnessy owners and all the other stakeholders who find the placement of such 5 townhouses so offensive, considering that $5 million has already been gained from the purchase? But further to this, there's also an interesting precedent set with the previous listed Heritage A projects, which received compensation for agreeing to restoration and designation. In the Greencroft project, our financial performance were evaluated by the City of Vancouver staff, and calculated compensation was based on a cost, which was the original purchase price of the property. This was done despite the fact that it was recognized by the assessment authority at the time, when these final compensation calculations were done, that the fair market value of the property had increased by approximately 50%. The current pro formas that have been structured by the quantity survey firm BTY and were modeled upon a structure that had been used in similar types of past projects, all of which had been accepted as accurate and valid by the city, clearly show that the value of the land to be taken at the current fair market value in this applicant scheme. This is being done for purposes of the required compensation calculation, knowing that the land value has increased by over 71% since purchase. I find it shocking that such enormous and ridiculously generous methodology is being used currently in compensation calculations, which allows the developer to simply put $5 million of lift into their pockets and then still come seeking yet more public benefits, and to do so and be supported by the city in what is likely to be the most contentious, precedent-setting public hearing that will ever occur in First Shaughnessy District in relation to its ODP. I also find it hugely troubling to the public interest and damaging to the credibility of this current application that such a major inconsistency exists in the way that the Greencroft pro formas were imposed by the city to reflect a purchase price that is historical cost basis, whereas this applicant is being given compensation based on a fair market value opportunity cost basis. I believe it's important that Council inquire from the city staff as to the justification for this change in evaluation policy. Notwithstanding the answer, this change alone in compensation evaluation methodology would be more than sufficient to allow the removal of not only the 5 hotly debated townhouses, but substantially more of the remaining 11 proposed units. I thank Mr. Spaxman for raising this important matter of the responsibility of the community and the suggestion that the current application needs to be more sensitive to the viewpoints of 90% of the stakeholders and less to the need for the creation of large numbers of compensatory titles and the attendant huge economic gain for the applicant. Mr. Richard Wood, who you'll hear from soon, has been extremely diligent in trying to make Council understand the critical importance of open book policy when it comes to financial calculations related to compensatory schemes for heritage designation. Further to this, Mr. Wood has spearheaded a successful effort to have a professional quality firm try to duplicate the financial performance of the developer in the city for this currently proposed scheme.
Summarize.
The survey form this has been done faithfully and in a manner consistent with all the past modeling work that was been accepted by city staff. Further to this, they've even used several of the key input valuations of the developer, which Valuations Council only very recently directed that the staff share with the leaders of the group opposing this development scheme.
Sir, if you have more, you could come back at the end and we could complete. But it sounds like you've got quite a bit more.
I do have a substantial amount of more, and I think it's all very important facts. Your Worship, my wife and I are going to be out of the country next week, and as a result, we won't be able to speak if this hearing is carried on. So I would appreciate an opportunity to continue later this evening.
You could always give this to us, and we'll photocopy it and pass it around as well.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Well, Councillor Ladner has a question.
I have a question to staff. There's been a big challenge here raised about the way we evaluate these things, and I don't know how many people are how aware of the work that we've done and of the meeting that we had between our real estate staff and the people who were doing their own analysis. And what I was told was a general agreement that we, in fact, had done a fair analysis. And I wonder if I could get a comment on that from staff.
Yes, we did meet with the BTY Group, who have undertaken the analysis on behalf of the Shaughnessy residents. And we have seen their latest pro forma analysis. The conclusions of that, and I certainly had a conversation with BTY, is that if they were consistent with the city methodology, particularly to do with developers' profit, that their pro forma analysis came up with a similar conclusion to the city analysis, that actually 16 townhouses was supportable under the pro forma.
And what about the argument that we should factor in the windfall profit from the increase in property value since it was purchased?
Well, the heritage policies and guidelines are clear. You're doing the valuations of the site unencumbered and in its encumbered state, and you're using market value as of the date of analysis.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Alan Askew, followed by Andre Molnar.
Good evening, Your Worship and councillors. I'm here this evening as a longtime Shaughnessy resident, and I'm here to speak in support of the proposed McRae Avenue residences. I'm also a sitting board member with the Vancouver Heritage Foundation. I support the city's efforts, past and present, to concentrate development along corridors, and feel strongly that every neighborhood within our city, including my own, should participate. There is little argument that Vancouver is growing and will continue to grow. People are coming to live here from all over the country and all over the world. We are constrained by mountains, the sea, and land use restrictions. The only way for us to grow, practically grow, is to densify. And I believe it is the only responsible way to grow as well. Our neighborhood commercial districts become more viable, more vibrant, transit works more efficiently, civic services become more economic, and the environment benefits through our decreased dependence on cars. The proposed McRae Avenue residence seems to be an ideal model for densification along corridors. Located on major corridors with bus service and adjacent to a major shopping district, I believe this development will succeed in actually getting a good number of people out of their cars and walking to the shops, restaurants, theatre, and art galleries of the South Granville shopping district. Also, because of a collaborative design approach undertaken thus far, neighborhood and heritage preservation interests have been well represented and carefully considered with this development. As a direct result of this process, the proposed development succeeds at preserving a significant heritage asset on the crescent, a significant heritage garden in front, without increasing the overall density of the FSR. This inclusive, collaborative approach is not a surprise to me, as this developer, Mr. Brian Bell, has an inspiring track record with his developments. His Fifth Avenue Cinemas development on Burrard Street and the multifamily development at 45 McDonald come to mind as sensitive signature projects that have improved the communities they're in. This project will be the best so far, in my view, and will mark an exciting signature development for the Granville entry to Shaughnessy. We cannot take for granted that the Heritage A home and Heritage Gardens will be preserved on this site. My hope is that Mr. Bell will be permitted to save this important home, preserve the streetscape of the Crescent, and create a sensitive showcase development. And I would just like to say a word about this website we're hearing about this evening. As a Shaughnessy resident, I have received numerous unsolicited, one-sided, fear-evoking flyers directing me to a well-financed Vote McRae website. The website asks me to take special note of how my neighbors are voting on the website for or against this development. Of course, this caused my wife and I to refrain from participating, as it was clearly one-sided, not meant to evoke a balanced discussion or debate. And that's part of the reason I felt compelled to come here and speak in support of the project tonight.
Andre Molnar, followed by Catherine Reichart.
Your Worship, Councillors, my family and I lived for many years in Shaughnessy, and as our children grew up, we basically ended up, my wife and I, in a large Shaughnessy home where we loved living by ourselves and decided to sell it. Once we sold our home, we had a real hard time finding appropriate accommodation in the neighborhood where we really wanted to live. Ended up living downtown, and we would love to move back into Shaughnessy. And I think that the problem is in Shaughnessy today that it caters mostly to families, and the large mansions cater to several members of families, and couples or empty nesters have really only choice they have is to move into an infill housing. And first of all, they're not suitable to everybody's taste, and secondly, there are very few available. I think that a property like this at the fringes of Shaughnessy across from a high-rise to be densified would be a perfect opportunity for people like ourselves to move back into Shaughnessy. And I understand Mr. Bell's long and reputable track record. He would be a good developer to develop this and create a Shaughnessy type of quality housing where empty nesters could live. So I think that, of course, I would like to see also the Heritage Mansion retained, and I understand, due to my background, very much the zoning and conditions what City Council and the city bylaws impose on properties, and I clearly understand that we could lose a beautiful potential mansion which could stand there forever once this development goes ahead, just because the neighbors have a NIMBY feeling and want to keep other neighbors or new neighbors to move into their neighborhood. And you see this human threat time after time in communities, but I think that council should take the opportunity and permit this project to go ahead. And basically, I was surprised to see Mr. Spaxman speaking against this project, because years ago I remember talking to him and having lunch with him and talking about Shaughnessy, and he was very proud of densifying Shaughnessy and letting people of different means moving into Shaughnessy, not only having large mansions in Shaughnessy like we had, and now we would like to live in Shaughnessy and have a townhouse type of accommodation, which is very rarely available. So I think that progress has to take place. This is not an area where you're middle of Shaughnessy. This is the fringes of Shaughnessy, really in a very high traffic, dense urban area, where I think these townhouses are very appropriate and very beautifully designed, and I think that people who will live there, and hopefully we will live there, would be very happy in. So I think you have a good developer, you have a good project, and you can keep a beautiful heritage home. Would be a terrible mistake not to let this project go ahead and not to have a nice new project in this neighborhood. So don't be afraid of change. Applaud change and support change. Once in a while, change is good, even in an old neighborhood like Shaughnessy. Thank you.
You have a question. Is that your question?
Well, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Molnar. Actually, my question is to staff, and inspired by what you're saying and a number of the other speakers have said. I'm just wondering about the demographic trends in Shaughnessy. Do we have... we did a census last year, and I'm going to guess we'll be coming back another night. So if you don't have it tonight, would you?
Yep. I don't, but we will do some digging.
Would you be able to bring us the numbers of how many people have been living there over the years and what the population is doing in the neighborhood? Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Molnar.
Catherine Reichert, followed by Anthony Hunt.
Good evening, Mayor, councillors, and visitors. My name is Catherine Reichert. My talk will be short, as I know the benefits of being short. I am a resident of Shaughnessy who took part in the co-design process involving the development of McRae. After reviewing the current updated plans, I have major concerns over the location and size of the middle 5-townhome unit called Block B. This concern is shared by the Urban Design Panel. Their minutes from June 20th, 2007 state, the 5-unit block in the middle of the project area was too constrained against the Heritage House. The first Shaughnessy Design Panel minutes say that the middle unit needs to change in its proximity to the Heritage House. Another states, like to see the 5 units reduced or preferably eliminated. The first Shaughnessy official development plan is an important policy that encourages the retention of heritage buildings, landscaping, and estate-like image of the area. Section 4.6.1 states a rear yard with a minimum depth of 10.7 meters shall be provided for a principal building. This current development plan has a rear yard changing from 5 meters to 10 meters along the back of the Heritage House. This is well below the allowed minimum. This difference is half the amount set up by the official development plan. Section 1.4.2 states the new development should present an estate image character that respects front yard setbacks, neighboring buildings, and privacy with siting in a landscape setting. How much privacy can there be with only 5 meters from the townhouse to the Heritage Pool? Let's hope no one is doing cannonballs while someone's having a nap outside. If this development is truly saving a Heritage A house, it also needs to save the heritage landscape in keeping with the house. This is part of the streetscape that defines Shaughnessy. Secondary development should complement the massing and scale of the principal Heritage House so that the dominance of the existing house stays evident. How can this happen when the middle townhome unit is 17,499 square feet and the Heritage House is only 5,000 square feet? The first Shaughnessy district is already being compromised with this rezoning into CD1, allowing townhouses and increased density. Picture a vast front lawn and a large 9,500 square foot Heritage House with an even larger 17,499 square foot unit townhome looming behind it. Shouldn't the residents at least be able to save some of the Shaughnessy estate setting and gain some compensation for having the city possibly allow the developer this rezoning? In summary, the residents are being asked to compromise and allow rezoning of the corner lot along Granville. I do not agree that we should also have to allow a middle Block B unit, which creates the look of too much density abutting on a Heritage House. This will ruin the heritage residential streetscape that defines Shaughnessy. I oppose the middle unit. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Anthony Hunt. Anthony Hunt, followed by Douglas Day.
Good evening, Your Worship, members of Council, ladies and gentlemen. Before I say anything, I should advise you that I am here representing myself. I speak for nobody else. The views I express are my own personally. By way of introduction, I should tell you that I have lived in and around the perimeter of Old Shaughnessy for over 50 years, and I walk by this particular property, I would say, almost every day. This property, the Old Shaughnessy lands, is a jewel owned by the citizens of Vancouver. And I say that because I equate this property, not this one, but I mean the Old Shaughnessy lands, with places like Queen Elizabeth Park, Van Dusen Gardens, and they all have boundaries. Stanley Park, for example, is the West End apartment buildings are built right up to the border of Stanley Park. Every instance where we have valuable properties like this have a boundary. So the fact that this particular development is on a corner of the boundary of Old Shaughnessy lands, which is not a particularly attractive piece of property as it appears, it's part of the Old Shaughnessy lands. And I'd like to depart from what a lot of our friends have said about the sensitivity and the ability of developers to infill in these lands. Really, that is not the issue. The issue is, what do we do to preserve the Old Shaughnessy lands? Because they represent, on both sides of Granville Street, they represent the green lungs of that area of the city. And consider what is happening on the north side of 16th Avenue down to Falls Creek. What do we have? We have a concrete jungle. And every day you see a new high-rise development, they're going up like mushrooms. So the green lung that I'm talking about is very essential now and in the future for the benefit of all of the citizens of Vancouver. I realize that it's council policy, and has been for a long time, to do everything possible to retain heritage homes. Nobody wants to see the Nickel House disappear any more than I do, because we would like to save it. But the trade-off in giving the owner of this property the ability to build 16 townhomes on the other corner there, I don't think that's a fair trade-off. In fact, as much as I love the Nickel House, I would be prepared to sacrifice the Nickel House to avoid that development. I don't want to get into the technical details too much, but a couple of things kind of come out and hit you in the face. One is the transfer of the floor plan ratio. And what has happened is that the staff have accorded a 0.4 floor space ratio to the development by taking it from the entire, by calculating it from the entire piece of parcel of land. Now, this seems a bit ridiculous, because on the front of the Nickel House, what we're doing in effect is, out of thin air, we're taking the value of that open space and applying it to the high-density development. Well, nothing is ever going to be built on the land in front of the Nickel House adjacent to the Crescent. So why give benefit to that? I could understand if you were going to transfer benefit because you were preventing something to be being built there, but that's not the case here. So we're giving a credit for the floor space ratio, which I don't think is a fair trade. In fact, it enables a proposal like this, which is a development on steroids. It's just absolutely ridiculous. Now, going back to the valuation of the property, in the staff valuation, they say that the Lot 1 beside Granville Street is worth $2 million. Well, let's say if we move the lot line of the center lot, and we said it was worth $2 million. So we have land value of $4 million on which you're going to build 16 townhouses. Well, if you divide that by 16, you come up with a figure of $250,000. So that means that these townhouses you're getting whoever buys them is getting the land value under the townhouse for $250,000. Where can you buy land in the center of Vancouver $250,000? It just doesn't make any sense.
And you have a question from Councillor Capri, actually.
Sorry.
It's actually a question
from Councillor Capri.
Thank you. It's actually a question to staff based on something the speaker said. I'm just wondering, with regards to the floor space ratio, did we use a different type of calculation for this property than we do for other properties?
No. Again, the thing I would point out is it's 0.45 overall. Under this scheme, the heritage site would be underdeveloped at 0.23, and the CD1 site would be overdeveloped at 0.63, and its floor space would be above grade. So those are the changes, but otherwise it's calculated in the same way.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry that I've taken so long, but in fairness to other neighbouring properties, the Sandwell House and the other one, which backs onto this property,
Sir, you could always come at the end and...
Yeah, all right, I'll come at the end. But these people are spending millions on these properties to retain the heritage value of their property.
So we'll put your name at the end to speak again. Douglas Day. Douglas Day. Oh, okay, Gordon Smith. BTY Group. Gordon Smith. Oh. Richard Charles Priestley Wood.
You need to give the full name. But I live next door but one to this development, just south of it. My wish in this is that the big house be retained and that it be designated, but that a fair trade be done in return for that. So I would beg your worship and council's patience for a few minutes whilst we just talk about numbers, because that's what this HRA is really about. There are only really 4 key numbers in an HRA. There's a lot of other things like interest rates and construction periods which don't matter nearly as much. The first is, what is the value now of that big house? What would the value be if we knocked it down? What would the value of the land be? And to make up for the difference between those two, you have to know the construction costs of the townhouses and the sale price for the townhouses. Those are the only 4 things that matter. Now, I was here at your meeting on January the 15th, where there seemed to be consensus amongst councillors that you needed to see those headline numbers. And there was even a motion by Councillor Louis that we not be here tonight and we not refer this to a public hearing until we'd all had a chance to digest those numbers. But Councillor Ladner and others argued that we could refer it to a public hearing because we'd have those numbers in plenty of time. More than a week was mentioned before this public hearing. Well, here we are, and we haven't got those numbers. The reason we're given is that those numbers, and we heard it again tonight, is that those numbers are proprietary information, and we have built trust with the development community by not giving away that information. Now, what developers depend upon is their savvy in building the house and in getting the best financing rates. None of that we're going to see, because that's all later, and that's none of our business. The pro forma is not proprietary information. It is a trade done between the city on our behalf and the developer, where line by line certain allowances are made. It's not really what he's going to spend, but it's what we're to estimate that he's going to spend in order to get to an amount of rezoning. There is no way that it can be described as proprietary information because it doesn't relate to what he's actually going to do. So I propose that you send yourself back with a mandate that you gave them a month ago with a specific instruction that we only have this meeting once we've all had a chance to review these numbers. In the meantime, because I was interested to know what the numbers were, because nobody's really concentrated on them, I appointed one of Vancouver's leading residential appraisal firms to appraise the value of the big old house and the value of the townhouses, both the lower blocks, Block A and Block B, how much the square footage would cost. We then appointed one of Canada's leading quantity surveying firms, BTY, to feed those numbers into the standard pro forma that the city and all cities and developers use for analysing these. The quantity surveyor met with the city real estate department and they tried to mesh their models and understand where we differed. The letter from the quantity surveyors is in the first package which councillors received on February the 12th, and it's the second white page under the green opposed intervening page. It's a letter from BTY which says at the bottom that using the current February 2008 valuations, they get to a number of 11 townhouses that would be required. We are not disputing that if you use 2006 valuations or the city's most recent summary valuations, you can get to 13, 14, 15 townhouses. But there's only one person that has sent independent outsiders, appraisers out to look at valuations, and that is us. And those valuations come to a number of 11 townhouses. Because of that, I propose that you reject this proposal and you ask the developer to come back with a more moderate and less dense proposal. Now, as a sanity check for these numbers, because these are all professionals giving their professional opinions, and we're just Vancouver residents. So let's see if we can see where the real difference lies. The real difference lies in that the big house is said by the appraisers to be worth now, as is, $10 million. If we believe that a big house is really a liability and it's worth very little, then we don't dispute that you would need to build 16 townhouses. The city says that the big house is worth a net $6.1 million in today's market. They get to that by saying 7.5 it would sell for if you spent 1.4 on it. So for a net 6.1. Now, I would ask you as Vancouver residents just to consider that the BCAA tax assessment on this house and land, as it is, not counting the wooded lot, is $8.6 million. Have we ever heard of a property being worth less in the current market than its BCAA tax assessment? So the city's number, 6.1, tax assessment, 8.6, market value, 10. That's where the difference lies between the 11 and the 16 townhouses.
Can you come up summarize, sir?
That's why the 16 townhouses can't be believed, and I would ask the council respectfully to send the developer back to come back with a less dense proposal.
Okay, Councillor Ladner has a question.
Mr. Wood, you've talked about not being able to get at the numbers or wanting to access the numbers, but there was the meeting, and there were a certain amount of numbers shown, and your conclusion seems to be that it's not whether this development is a fair deal, but just what the exact number should be, 11 or 16. So are you in favor of 11 townhouses on that site?
I'm in favor of saving the big house, and if about 19,000 square feet is what there is in that Block A, if about 19,000 square feet needs to be built, and that's what makes the equation balance, then I'm in favor of it. I prefer, of course, if it could be in coach houses or a more Shaughnessy-like thing, but I'd leave that to the planning department to work on the developer with.
So you're leaving us with a discussion about the fine-tuning of the numbers with our real estate experts on staff. That's what you're referring us to do.
I'm saying that an independent valuer, and the only one that's been engaged here, and a quantity surveyor, has said we need that Block A to correctly recompense the developer with all the profits that the city accepts to recompense the developer for this designation. And that's what I think we should be doing.
Well, I think I may be repeating what I said earlier, but we had an in-camera meeting with our real estate people, and they said, we know that you're concerned about this, and we're not telling you all these numbers because it's too detailed, and there are other proprietary matters even between us and them. But we did have a meeting with the real estate people and your people, and we came very close to, in fact, even to the point where, by some ways of doing it, there should even be more units there. And so I left that meeting satisfied that we had done all we could do to be fair, and that you or somebody from your group had overlooked those numbers and come to more or less the same conclusion. And you're pretty close to that point now when you're saying that it's between 11 or 16. And
I think if we accepted that the big house was worth 6.1, which is a 7.5 with 1.4 spent on it, then BTY's numbers wouldn't be that far from the city's numbers. But it's not worth 6.1 million. And we all know that. I mean, if Vancouver was the type of city that it was perhaps in 2006, when this all started, then it might be worth that. People perhaps didn't want 11,000 square foot houses, but with Vancouver being what it is now, and that being one of the great estates in Vancouver, we just can't believe that it's worth less than an 8-figure sum.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Chow.
Thank you, Your Worship. So, Mr. Wood, so those four figures you would like to actually get it from somewhere in order to satisfy yourself as to a fair compensation for the developer.
In a private meeting, and as it sounds like councillors have as well, we have received verbally 3 of those 4 figures. And what we haven't received is the unencumbered land, what the land is said to be worth if you knock down the building. But the BC tax assessment gives that number as 10.6 for the unencumbered land. And we understand from the city that they're using a number around 12.5. But so we're not substantially disagreeing once you put the numbers into the formulas are the same. It's just the inputs to the formula that differ.
Well, exactly. I think it all depends on what assumptions are you making, you know. And I think that's the crux of the problem. So, thank you.
Okay, Council, we're now over time, so we will recess this meeting to Tuesday, February 19th at 7:30 p.m. in Council chambers. And I'd like to remind councillors that it's important that you do not engage in any discussion or correspondence in regard to this application. Thank you.